First of all, I just want to thank you for inviting me, actually, and everyone for coming here. This is a really great venue, and I'm hoping that we'll have fun tonight. So I'm from Austria. I think that was like part of the context. Even though my last name is Japanese, we can get to that later on if you want to. I grew up in Knittelfeld, which is a small town near the Formula One racetrack. So if you know Austria, if you know Formula One, I'm from like around the corner of the racetrack. So I discovered the internet as a teenager. That's just like the early 2000s. That's like maybe some folks that look like a similar age than me, like have a similar experience. And I started coding, and like the way I started, like there was not like my English wasn't that good. I didn't have anyone in school like teaching me or anything. So the only way I could really learn it is by finding materials in German that like somebody wrote and gave away for free. I was like a middle school student at the time that had like obviously no money. So, and like, computers were still so new, at least to my parents, that like I couldn't go and be like, hey, I want to learn how to program, being like in like a small town. And so the nice thing about like learning HTML and like JavaScript and CSS and also maybe PHP to a lesser extent, but like all these web technologies at the time, there were no like bundlers, there was no like compilation, right? So whenever somebody published a website, it was like literally the same thing that person wrote. So you could go on any website and then right click and then view source and see exactly what that website was made of. And that was pretty powerful, right? And so through that and like some German tutorials, I like learned how to code. And then pretty quickly, I was starting to like use other people's code. Like other people were, putting open source out there. And I came across this book by Linus Torvalds. I was like 13, 14 maybe. And, you can, for people who know who Linus Torvalds is, he created Linux, and he's a bit of a divisive figure in the community because he can be really harsh. And like nowadays, he's still maintaining Linux, but the only thing you really hear from him is when he's like really harsh and like, calling somebody mean words or something like that. So, I don't really appreciate any of that, even though I do understand it from an open source maintainer perspective. But he wrote this book called Just for Fun. And it sounded cool, and I read it. And I just thought this idea of him thinking he can build something that's better than whatever they were using, that his professor wrote at university. Like he was like, I can build a better operating system and just give it away for free to everyone. I thought that idea was like so powerful. And if you spin this out, like in a way, you're kind of helping human progress, right? Because it's very likely that everyone comes up with like some good idea and like they build that at the company, and then you keep it as your like intellectual property and you never share it or you license it or whatever. But then everyone else has to come up with the same idea, right? And if you put it out there as open source, you can just use that and like everyone can build on top of it, and you don't have to reinvent it all the time. And if you look back now, I think in the early 2000s, Linux was already pretty successful, but now it's like powering most computers, right? Or if not that, then the ideas that went into it power most computing devices, right? And so that is just the greatest thing to me, I think.
Mm-hmm. To go maybe a little bit philosophical, psychological, can you trace any of this kind of background? I want to build something that can be shared by others, maybe to you, how you grew up or the values your parents share with you. I'm just curious because I can understand the reasoning, and I 100% agree. Yet I never kind of made this mental switch in my head. This is what I'm gonna do.
Yeah, I mean, it's really just that thing where, I discovered I learned all of that for free, right? Like all I needed was a computer with internet, and I learned how to write code for free as like a teenager. And, I just never even thought about doing it in any other way, right? Like I want to, like all the code that I write, or at least everything that I learned from writing that code, I want to be able to give that to other folks, because I think that other folks are probably way better at coding than me. So if I can help them get to that point, they can probably build something better.
Okay, got it. So you are just a better person than me.
No, I wouldn't say that.
Okay. This is actually favorite part of the interview because it's so understated, or the Mootools are understated, I think. And I vaguely remember it during the time when I was a hardcore backend developer, and I had to write some JavaScript by force, and I didn't enjoy it at all. And that was the time when I actually of course I knew jQuery, and I also researched Mootools, and I was like, this is so much better. But I was the only one in the company, because I don't know, for some reason jQuery won. And actually I looked it up even today. There are 10.5 million npm downloads every week of jQuery. But you joined the Mootools community, so maybe tell us a little bit more about that. I'm sorry about the
to give some context here. Like, has anyone heard of Mootools? Oh wow, that is actually quite a lot of people. And of those who have heard of it, who has used it? Oh wow, yeah, okay. You guys have been around for a while. Or if you've recently used it, then that must have been an interesting experience. So Mootools was part of the first generation of JavaScript framework. So there's like widely considered, I think, 3 generations. I think nobody has updated it. Maybe there's already 4. But there's 3 generations of JavaScript framework. So the current one is the React, Vue.js, Astro, Solid, Svelte, like these sort of like frameworks. Before that, there was Backbone, and was it Knockout.js? Like there was these like MVC kind of frameworks that just didn't really work well and fit well into this JavaScript world. And before that was the jQuery, Prototype, and Mootools world. And the big difference between jQuery, that's something that I'm assuming most folks have heard about, was that at the time, when you look at JavaScript, there was ES3, and then there was this proposal for ECMAScript 4, which was going to have classes and like every syntax feature and every language feature you could imagine. And ES5 was not even on the horizon. And then what happened was that ES4 failed. As far as I know, the only thing that there was like this thing where I think, was it IBM or Intel, one of those big bad tech companies, they were like opposed to how floating point numbers were being done in ES4, or some like really minor detail. And then the entire proposal completely fell apart. And then it wasn't clear where JavaScript was going to go. And ES5 wasn't even like on the horizon yet, and ES6 like took until 2015, right? And I'm talking about 2005 and 2006, right? And so it was this guy, Valerio Proietti from Italy, and he was like, I reject all these other frameworks. What I like is actually extending the JavaScript native objects like array or object or string instead of like adding utility functions somewhere else. The downside of that is that when you add like something to array.prototype or something, whenever a browser wants to actually make JavaScript better and add like the same method, then every website built with that framework might break or might not break. And that might all sound really abstract, but the one thing that I'm responsible for, that's like my minor impact on web browsers, is that whenever you're checking if something is an element of an array and you're doing array includes, the reason it's not called contains is because of Mootools. Because when that was being added, it turned out that like a bunch of websites broke. And like a bunch is a very large number. So it couldn't be added. And so obviously the problem was that at some point JavaScript actually kept evolving, and then extending all those like native JavaScript types became like a really bad choice. And that's one reason why Mootools eventually went away.
You should put it in your bio. I was reading it, it's not there. That's nice. Okay, and I think that Mootools actually had a more profound impact on the future of JavaScript frameworks. I was listening to one podcast where you were mentioning some names that were part of the Mootools community, and which projects they either founded or joined later.
Yeah, some of us all, or like, half of that team ended up at Facebook. So Tom Okino, he was my manager for most of my time at Facebook. He was the first one that like joined from Mootools, like was like kind of, poached by a recruiter kind of. Poach is the wrong word because Mootools was not a real like company, it was just an open source project. And then shortly after that, I joined Facebook as an intern. So I was like the second person to join Facebook. And then after that, I think we were up to like 7 folks from that Mootools core team that like ended up at Facebook, and like most of them ended up working on React or Relay or Jest or like any of those frameworks that you might have heard of.
So thank you for that pivot to Facebook. So maybe can you elaborate how did you ended up building Jest and Yarn? Maybe what was the first?
For context, I'm actually curious, like who has used Jest? Oh wow, it's almost everyone. Like who is not using Jest anymore? Oh wow, yeah, okay, that's cool. Same here. Current status. Okay, so this is also interesting. Similar to Mootools, I didn't actually start either Jest or Yarn. And for Jest, that was like actually a really interesting story where when I joined as an intern at Facebook in 2011, I was working on JavaScript testing, and there was no Jest. There was like nothing like it. And I was just like upgrading all of the front end testing that we had at Facebook at the time, like swapped out whatever framework was there for Jasmine, which was the expectations and assertions library and the test runner at the time. But I didn't know that there was another team kind of prototyping what I built, but with Node. And we weren't actually collaborating. And then after a while, that team kind of internally, sorry, that wasn't open source. It was like internally at Facebook, they released this thing called JST, so JavaScript test. And it was actually not very good. It just like, it was this thing that one or two people built, and then they never touched it again, and it like ran all of Facebook's tests. And then React was built, and that was the test framework at Facebook. And so React was open sourced, and the React team at the time was like, hey, what are we going to do? There's no good JavaScript testing framework that like solves our needs, and we don't want to rewrite all of our tests in open source to another framework because we already have this thing JST. So somebody at Facebook took JST and just kind of put it on GitHub. There's a bunch of work involved making that work, and that person put it there, and then React could be open sourced, and then it was rebranded as like Jest, and then React was using Jest for testing, and then that person went on and worked on something else again. And so that went on for 2 years, where and this happens quite often at large tech companies where there's often no funding for like a specific project, but it has to be open source for some reason. And then that person just moves on, but the company is like, hey, let's make a PR moment of this. Let's tell everyone how great this testing framework is. But then, everybody moves on and nobody works on it. And so I came onto the scene to like work active. I like contributed like minor changes to Jest. I was working on JavaScript infrastructure, but I was working on React and Relay at the time. And so I only made minor contributions, and Jest kind of really started to suck. Like it's just, any software, you have like 1,000 engineers using it every day and like adding more tests, and like nobody's maintaining the actual thing that runs the test. Like that just happens, right? And so I was kind of coming off from working on Relay. So Relay is a data framework for working with React and GraphQL. And I wasn't really sure what to work on next. And my manager, Tom, at the time, he was like, hey, we really need someone to work on Jest. And I'm like, no way. I'm not going to touch it. It sucks. I hate it. The code base is so bad. I want to just throw this thing away. Like I just said in that one-on-one, I said, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to touch it. But then I thought about it, and then I realized that nobody else is working on it. So there's like a big opportunity there to do something fun. And like in general, like I actually really don't like working on projects that are working well, because the problem is when there's like 10 people working on a project, everybody uses it, everybody's happy, and then you come to that project and it's like, okay, I'm gonna make these 1% improvements, And I think that's really important. Like you need those people that are really excited about that, but to me, it's just that's not what I want to do. I want to take something that everyone hates and turn that into something good, or create something that's like good and replace the thing that people hate. And so that's kind of how I came onto Jest.
Okay. You kind of broke my romantic view of how enlightened Facebook was to open source everything and invest a lot of money and a lot of people on maintaining them. You kind of broke that, but I think it's a nice story.
That's the funny thing. Like, I think in general at Facebook, I cannot speak to what Meta is doing. I never worked at Meta. I left Facebook before it rebranded, and just before. So it was actually a very clean cut for me. I never worked at Meta. I only worked at Facebook, and things might have changed. But at the time, the way I observed it, and I spent most of my time working on open source projects while I was at Facebook. The thing is that you don't work on these open source projects, or Facebook doesn't invest headcount into working on those open source projects out of the goodness of their hearts, and like you can argue whether they should or not, but the idea is, hey, we need these technologies to support our platforms. So, here's this much headcount that we want to dedicate to that to solve specific problems for the company, right? And so everything on top of that is like, maybe you get you spend 80% or 90% of your time on the company problems and then 10% of time on open source. But then the problem is that open source can be so much bigger than what the company needs. And so engineers are like kind of burning out. right? Where it's like this, hey, I only have 10% of my time for open source and I get all these issues. People are like, writing mean things on Twitter about me or our project. And Facebook is kind of like, well, where's the impact of you working on this open source project? And so one thing that we did in our group, so I was also heavily involved with like hiring front-end engineers, both in the US and in London after I moved from the US to the UK, is that we tried to turn, hey, here are these isolated projects that we open sourced into like, hey, this is the front-end brand, the front-end open source brand of Facebook. So if one of those projects is suffering, we really need to like figure out how to make that good, because this is like our major recruiting angle. And if like all of our open source projects, or even just a few, really suck, then we're going to lose out on great candidates that could come to Facebook and drive company and business value.
So many potential questions here. Maybe I would go back to when you actually took over Jest, and you said that it was in such a bad shape. How do you decide what to work on? How to start? Like you see such big pile of shit. How do you decide where to start?
And you can still like, I don't know if that tweet was deleted. Twitter search is like notoriously bad for like the past, but like there was this one tweet, and so this is hilarious. We had like our websites for our open source projects, and we kind of kept it was before Docusaurus. It's like this open source kind of thing, open source website document generator thing. So we kind of just took the React website and copied that and made it the Jest website and copied that and made it the Relay website or whatever. And one of the things that it had this widget that would show like all the tweets tagged with like a specific hashtag, like Jest.js or whatever. And so we had like on the website, here's what people are saying about Jest. And then the top thing was, Facebook says use Jest, haha, I'd rather die. So it's like, that was on the Jest website. So that's how bad the project was at the time.
So your first move was to remove that widget?
Yeah, we did remove that. But it's a good talking point in like these sort of events. The way I'm a big fan of incremental improvement. I think it's very easy. You show up to your job and you're like, oh my God, this system sucks. I'm just going to rewrite a better one. And then you realize you have one person spending 3 years replacing a system and not shipping it or something, right? Like that happens all the time. And so the way I've seen other people be successful, but also the way I've been successful until that time at Facebook was by taking something that didn't work well and then incrementally like making it better. And so code mods, JavaScript code mods, where you apply certain AST transformations on individual files, like I was able to like modify the entire Facebook JavaScript code base, like millions of lines of code with like a script, and so I thought maybe we can do similar things to Jest, because we have like thousands of tests. Nobody's going to rewrite those tests. So even if I build a new testing framework, we still have all those old tests. And I cannot go, at Facebook doesn't work that way that you say, hey, go and use my thing, right? Like it's like, it will only be used by teams if it's good. And so you have to either make something dramatically better that a team would say, we're going to stop feature development to rewrite our tests, which is never going to happen, right? Or you just upgrade everything for them, right? And so pretty quickly I arrived at the conclusion that, hey, Jest really sucks. And we need to build something new, but the only way to get there is by incremental improvements, right? And so I tried to take Jest apart into like different pieces. And that's also actually how we came up with workspaces in Yarn. Before that was Lerna, because I was starting to take pieces apart into different packages. And then the problem is if you put them into different repos and you have to like npm publish every time you make a change and then update in another repo, it's like really painful. And so I started taking Jest apart so that each individual package can be rewritten like in place as long as it conforms to a specific API. And like some of like the idea of how we were building Jest like made it into like Yarn and workspaces to support that pattern better, which I think is pretty widely used now.
I still cannot stop thinking how powerful it is, powerful role of a software engineer, that you can yourself fully decide on a direction, on what are we going to do, and you can shape the future of entire generation of people who build their projects around Jest. I think it's amazing compared to typical product companies, product teams, where you have always the kind of the product manager who tells you what to do, and your kind of movement space is very limited. Did you think about it that way?
Being at a large tech company like Facebook, there's like a small advantage. I don't know if it's still true today or like what other companies would be like that now, but one of the advantages is that yes, on product teams it'll be like that, but for infrastructure there are these projects like, okay, there's thousands of tests, there's like literally hundreds of thousands of test runs on CI every day. Anytime somebody makes a change and there's like, a few thousand engineers, it runs that framework, right? But at the same time you have 0 people who know how that framework works and who actually work on that framework. So there's a lot of opportunity to make changes, right? You just have to justify that there's an impact in doing that. And for Jest, like one way to justify that was to, hey, instead of spending an hour to run all of the tests, we can run them all in 1 minute. That was like a good start. And that, like, for a company like Facebook, there's an insane amount of money that you're saving by not using all the dev servers to run continuous integration tests for slow tests.
Yeah, that way you can always put money on the investment into the development.
Yeah. And the other thing is also like what you're just saying is like, hey, I cannot really believe that like nobody works on this, and you can just go and make decisions. Like I had these like funny moments. When I was managing React Native in London, we used to do these weekly React Native lunches. So we invited like various companies that were building something with React Native in the UK, in London or in the UK, whoever wanted to travel, just to meet us for lunch. And it was like a very easy thing for me to do because I just put out a Calendly invite on Twitter. I vetted those people and they just came to us and we had to eat lunch anyway. So it's very easy to organize, but like it made everyone on the team and like those folks really happy. But then, those folks would come, and then like they show up with like 5 people. And then I'm like, here's like half of our team, also 5 people. Everybody else is like, out of office or doing something else. And they're like, hey, can you show me the React floor? Where are all the React folks, Mm-hmm. We're like, well, we have about 5 desks over there, or like, maybe 15 desks or whatever. There's a few people from React, but like, they expected the entire floor to be React. And we were like, hey, in London, we're like 15 people. In the US, we're like maybe 40 people, just over 50 or something like that, So there's fewer people than you imagine. And what I also learned is that most of the time when any of these projects become successful in open source, it's not because they worked at that company and that company told them to do open source. It's because these people, they were so dedicated to making that project amazing in open source. And they usually go above and beyond. They work on those problems for this framework at Facebook during the day, and then they go home and they keep working on that project, but on the open source part.
This brought an interesting question. Were there any time external contributors, or was Facebook considering it? Right? How did it work
for Jest specifically? Yeah, this is interesting because Jest was in the state where external contributions couldn't have helped because the project was in such a poor state. You really need somebody dedicated to work on it full time. I was lucky. At the time, it was so obvious that it was bad that the ads team was like really struggling because we were trying at Facebook to change. We had this weekly push model. So anytime you made a change to Facebook, it would go live every Tuesday at like 2 p.m. or whatever. So you merge during the week, it goes out every Tuesday at 2 p.m. The company was actually pushing like 3 times a day, but like you would have to like request like a change to be merged or whatever. And, even now that like in 2024, it sounds like really slow to me. And I think for many companies, it might still be fast. But Facebook was like, hey, this is not a sustainable model because we have like, 15,000 pull requests basically every Tuesday going out. We need to ship faster. And so we changed that model to be continuous push. So every time you merge something, within like an hour, it would go out to like, 3 billion people now. And that model is still what Facebook has. And so the ads team was like struggling with this thing. Hey, we keep breaking our front end. We're losing millions of dollars every day because like we have like some stupid change that we cannot test. And then the ads team really needed some support. So I was able to actually convince somebody to join Facebook who was really into testing, but they were kind of, I wouldn't say forced, but like the ads team kind of took priority on like, picking great people from like front end. So he was joining ads, but he ended up actually working full time with me. Mm-hmm. We got a lot of external contributors once we turned Jest around to be actually a good framework. And then there were a lot of eyes on it. And then a lot of contributors came in and some of them are still on the project today.
Okay, nice. And since you took it over in a really bad shape, you had to take down the widget with the recent tweets. What was the moment, or do you recall a moment, or maybe change when it started turning it around? Mm-hmm. And did you ever add back the widget to the website?
I don't think it has it. No, I don't think anyone is still doing that. I think now you would also have to pay Twitter like $2,000 a month just to be able to scrape that, get that data from the API. Yeah, no, there's actually, and you can still find it. So this was really interesting. So at Facebook, Jest was like, at that point, Jest was like good enough, or people were happy with it. People actually started liking it. And then there was this thing that we just published. It was Create React App. Because at the time, this is the other thing, like tools like Jest or like React, even at the time, they were really hard to set up. Like people just in open source didn't really know. And the reason for that is because at Facebook, nobody ever has to set up React or Jest or any of those tools, because there's the Jest team or the React team that sets it up one time and maintains that setup for the entire monorepo for everyone, right? So we're like, hey, here's React, we'll open source that. And people are like, I don't know what to do with these JavaScript files, like how do I put this into my project, or like how do I set it up? And so a bunch of folks like Christoph, his username is Viju. He worked on React Native, CSS and JS, a bunch of really prettier as well, a bunch of great projects. He worked with the community on Create React App. This is something that some of you who have used React for a while probably have used. It was a project that was never used at Facebook internally for anything, but it was made by Facebook and some external contributors, and it was put on the Facebook GitHub org as like, hey, here's how you should use React at that time in like 2015, 16. And then Dan Abramov, I think, and some other folks, they came to me and they're like, hey, we don't have a test framework in Create React App. Can we put Jest in? And I'm like, nope, it's not ready. It still sucks. I don't want to do this. But then somehow they convinced me, and then I opened like a pull request for it. I really didn't want to do it. It was more like, hey, here's what it would look like for discussion. And then people were like, no, Jest sucks, like all these open source contributors, and I'm like, hey, I get it. But here are all the things that have changed in Jest. We rewrote it. We have like 2 people working on it full time. We have, it's ready for community contributions, and we have like a lot of them now. This thing is being supported, and it's like, this much faster. Like I gave all the reasons. Like it wasn't like, hey, please use my framework, because I worked on it so hard. It's like, here are the facts of like why it's different now than what you might have as perception of this framework. And that was actually like, there was a big debate actually of, hey, we rewrote Jest completely. It used to suck. It doesn't suck anymore. Should we rename that project and just call it something else? And we just realized that it doesn't matter. Like, if it's better, people will use it. And if it's not, then it doesn't matter what name it has.
Nice. And what was the moment when you moved on from Jest?
Okay, yeah, that took a long time. I think when I was working on Jest, and like really shortly actually after we added it to Create React App, which was like, I think, a big moment where more people started using it. I moved from the US to the UK, and I started managing the JavaScript infrastructure team. So this is like this weird story, like where Facebook has this like kind of dev infra team, and they support all the programming languages, C and Java and Python and Rust nowadays and all these languages. But somehow the leadership in that group always really hated JavaScript, which doesn't make any sense because, it's like the biggest monorepo is like PHP and JavaScript. Like most of the product engineers are going to write PHP and JavaScript, right? And somehow they just didn't want to support JavaScript. And so we always had this Chase Infra team, and then it got shut down, and then we had it again, it got shut down. And then I went to London. I'm like, I'm going to build a new JS Infra team. And there were a bunch of great folks. And then I handed Jest to like 1 or 2 other folks. But then the same thing happened again, where it's like, okay, we're working on this portfolio of projects. We're supporting JS Infra for all of Facebook. We're supporting Yarn, which we were just building. And then Metro, which was like the React Native bundler, which it still is, and Jest, and like 1 or 2 other projects actually. And then, you look at that portfolio of projects, and you have to do planning, and you go to your leadership, and like people are like, hey, I heard Jest is good now. Why would we keep working on that, right? And so I had to kind of move people away from Jest that were reporting to me. But at the time, we built such a strong open source community that the project got way more contributions from outside of Facebook than internally. So it was like, it turned from this, hey, this is a really terrible project, into like one of the biggest success stories in open source, where, Facebook didn't have to do anything and got all this value out of like this framework that was on its GitHub org. And that was, I think, I was still involved in it until like late 2019, or like heavily involved, but I wasn't really actively coding on it because I was mostly managing a team and mostly working on React Native stuff.
You actually, this might be an interesting question. I keep seeing it more like anecdotal, but I keep seeing these Instagram videos, American boss versus European boss, and American team versus European team, and culture, work ethics, maybe, and energy they put into the work. How would you compare the teams in the US and in UK?
Yeah, I've also managed teams in Asia, so that is also like another level. Yeah. I mean, you know, you told me you worked in SF, right? So I think the easy answer here is that in the US everything is like possible and everybody's like, yeah, let's do it, and like everybody's happy. And when you move closer to Europe, it's like, I'm not sure. This sucks. I don't know if we can do this, right? So that's honestly that was. It's interesting that you bring it up. I haven't thought about this for a while, but like that was a downer sometimes. And like what I really learned from my first management experience on the JS Info team was that when you start managing a team and you seed it with a few people, like let's say there's, you know, you pick somebody who is already on like an adjacent team and then like 2 other folks that just hired, and then they set the culture for your team. And even if you remove those people from the team later, the culture that they set on the team will persist. And so I had this actually where like one of the folks was like, you know, not negative, but like, you know, cynical maybe, right? And like that was something where on the first team, I really noticed like the whole team was cynical even after that person had left. And when I built the second team where I moved on to manage like React Native more directly, I really focused on like just trying to, you know, I brought some Americans onto the team. So we were all a bit more positive, like had a can-do attitude, and just, you know, have certain inside jokes or like whatever, or like just really trying to kill the cynicism in from the beginning. And like I was like, that was honestly something where nobody cares and very few people notice this, but it really matters on the grand scheme of things of like how your team is performing and like how your team is viewed by all the surrounding teams. And so you have to be really careful with the first few people that you see the team with and the culture that you set.
Yeah, it's funny that you have similar visualization of how it actually works. It was very similar for me when I was moving from US to here. I was working at Microsoft at that time, and it was actually the moment when Microsoft was switching to DevOps mode. We were moving to Azure, and there was really little reason to keep infrastructure teams. So there was this big shift to actually have on-call duties by the engineering teams, and my former US team took it. Okay. Yeah, that's what we do now. And in here, people were actually thinking of starting a union and going on strike against this change. So I firsthand I saw kind of this big difference in how people think about their work. All right. So another big transition for you, like moving from individual contributor to engineering manager. How was it for you, and how is it to navigate a team and kind of maintain productivity in a growing company? Like by this time, Facebook was pretty sizable. So how did you think about it? I know you thought about it thoughtfully, because I heard it in one of your other interviews.
I think once you switch to management, you start getting an insight into like the organization that you don't have as an individual contributor. And that can kind of like give you superpowers if you move back to be an individual contributor, because you suddenly understand all these things that you ideally never hear about when you have a good manager, right? Because ideally you have a good manager who like allows you to focus on the things that you're good at. And like, you know, there's like, some people might have heard of it, that it's called like the shit umbrella, where like, you know, the manager is the one that holds this umbrella of like all the shit flies at your team, and like, you know, just make sure that the team doesn't get affected by it. And I really like that. And the thing that sucks is that that's really tough, you know, and I have had a bunch of managers that I'm not very fond of who didn't do that well at all. And they're, you know, where like information just flows through them, and then the team is like, what are we going to do with this? You know, what are we going to do with this crap, kind of? And that's really frustrating, right? So I think that was a big learning, just like taking care of people. But it's also really, really tough when you're doing a good job at it. So I can totally see why there's a lot of managers that are not good when they're not doing these sort of things, because they would be overwhelmed by that.
and kind of this part of productivity in a bigger company. What do you think are the kind of good recipes to keep the spirit up, even if you hold the umbrella right? People have eyes and ears, and they can see what's happening around them, and it might demotivate them. How did you work with motivation?
This is a good example, like when reorgs happen, right? Like this is why I hate reorgs. Like reorgs are like, when you reorganize teams in larger organizations and you're like, oh, these 3 people are now reporting to this, these 5 people are now working on something else, because engineers, they're just fungible. You just move them from project to project. Doesn't matter. They don't have feelings, right? That's how it always feels that like larger, like VPs or something think about, right? And I hate reorgs because, yeah, sure, you go and you execute the reorg and then you have a new world. But actually, like leading up to it, it's a huge amount of work to like organize that. And then afterwards, it takes like 6 months for like a team or for people to settle. And like I came to one team once where they were through like a really shitty reorg that was executed really poorly, and like it like kind of like left emotional scars on people, right? Even though like they kept their job, but then they kept working on the same thing, but like some people were moved to other teams, and like their entire like work life kind of just completely got like mixed, and so that like leaves scars, right? And like those are the sort of things that like can really hurt productivity. And I've seen that at Stripe as well, where it just felt like reorg after reorg, where you look at what the team has done in a year and it's basically nothing. And then it's like, well, what are we doing here, right? And when the organization grows, like you have this thing where you spend all this time talking about the work you're going to do instead of actually going and doing the work. And I think you have to have a really strong manager and like, director, VP, like whatever chain you have, that kind of reinforces how important the work is that the team is doing. And you need to learn how each individual person wants to be rewarded and appreciated about the work that they're doing as well. Because, quite often the director can come in, it's like, hey, I love the work you're doing, it's great. And everyone's like, especially then in Europe, it's like, we don't care what this person says, like I don't feel it, I'm not feeling it. One thing we were lucky about at Facebook, especially in London, is we were kind of insulated from some of this kind of stuff. And we also didn't have PMs or TPMs, or like we didn't have people that were like on our, like looking over our shoulders and like, are you done with this yet? Right? Like it was still very engineering driven. Engineers could come up with what they want to focus on. And then, me as a manager, for example, I would be responsible of like selling that work as like, hey, this is why these people or why this team needs to focus on these tasks. And that way I feel like we were able to keep kind of like an insulated space where it's like, hey, we're having a lot of impact. We're shipping stuff both in open source and both for the company. And that works really well. And then the final thing I guess I would say is, if you're doing open source work and you're also having to support a company, what I always try to do when I was managing a team, but also in my own individual open source work, is to find a way to align the work that the company needs with what the project in open source needs. Because if all the work you're doing is something that can just be open source automatically and that's useful for other people and is also having impact for your company, then you're doing open source work, but you're selling it as, hey, I'm improving this business metric for the company.
Do we have some questions from the audience?
Yeah. I think this is related. So you mentioned a lot of hate about Jest right at the beginning. So do you have some tips on how to kind of motivate people to work on something that everyone hates, like Jest? At that time?
Just point out the opportunity. This is also actually the reason why I switched to management. When I was working with people at Facebook, so there was this one person I mentioned who was working on it full time, Aaron Abrams, and then there were a bunch of other folks that were like spending, maybe a month or 3 months or so, like working on Jest. Like whoever I could get and motivate to work on Jest, I would like try to work with them. And what I learned is that what really helped me was not seeing just the improvements for Jest, but I also noticed that those people had really positive career outcomes, right? And so, at the time I didn't realize like I was, hey, go work with me on this shitty project, right? But what I actually was helping them with is like, hey, if you work with me on this, it will probably have a positive outcome on your career. That's apparently, how I communicated that to those people. And then when that happened, that positive outcome for them, I realized, hey, actually, I should probably switch to management. Now is the time.
All right. So I feel that we are slowly phasing to the next part of your life. Maybe tell me at which point you started thinking about starting your own company. At which point you knew it will be a gaming studio, and at which point you made the final cut.
Yeah. We haven't even mentioned it, right? Right now I'm running an indie game studio in Tokyo. So it's quite a departure from what I've worked on previously. But I'm still writing JavaScript, and I'm still using all the same technologies that at some point I've worked on.
But not just.
Not just, but React, Relay, GraphQL, and all of those. Also not Yarn, because different reasons. Yeah. I mentioned Stripe, and the thing that happened for me was that I really wanted to be at Stripe, but then we had our second daughter, or she was on the way, and I realized, hey, actually, I don't enjoy it as much as spending time with my kids, and I think I just don't really enjoy managing in this organization. It's maybe it's a great place, it's a great company, but it's maybe not for me. So I decided to take paternity leave in Japan, and it's really nice. You get to take a really long time, up to a year off, but it's mostly unpaid. So that part kind of sucks. So mostly lived on savings. So glad that we had the luxury kind of to do that. But then looking after two small kids is amazing, and I love them a lot. And even if I got 8 hours of sleep every day, I was just still dead every morning. I was I just cannot keep doing this. I don't know who has kids, but some people might be yeah, I get it. Some people who don't have kids, you should still have kids. Kids are great. But what I did then is hey, I want to, as a kid, as a teenager, the reason I started coding, so we can kind of close the loop on this, is that I wanted to build video games and social networks. And so I built those as teenagers. I even shipped a bunch of those. And then I worked for 10 years at a social networking company. So I thought, okay, I kind of crossed that one off. But I haven't gotten back to gaming yet. And so instead of sleeping during paternity leave, I started coding just to get some balance back in my life, right? And it also, at the time, I had been an engineering manager for I think 6 years or so. And so I just thought I tried to always stay technical, but there's some things that, were when you work at a big tech company, you never have to think about how to deploy your code, right? And previously as a teenager, I wrote PHP, I put it on my server, I had my own hardware server, and I ran it. And obviously I knew the cloud, but I never really used it, because at big tech companies, you just write code, ship it, and some team magically makes it work, right? And so I wanted to kind of just get back into figuring out how these things work to be more of a complete engineer, in 2022 or 2023 or now. And so I wanted to just build a video game to be able to learn all these new things that I hadn't done for a long time by being stuck in JS infra. And so I did that. And instead of sleeping, even though I didn't have much sleep anymore, I felt so much better, because I just felt like I was doing something with my brain. And then it was pretty clear very quickly that afterwards I wouldn't return to Stripe. And I didn't really plan on starting a company, but the thing is, I still don't have a great plan in the end, right? But the thing is that, I'm I'm going to quit this company. I'm going to have to figure out pension payments and health insurance, and it's better to be employed somewhere, right? And so you pretty quickly arrive on you need some sort of entity to support you in that, right? So it makes sense to start a company to be able to do, game development or something like that, and pay pension and, all this stuff in Japanese that is super hard to understand and still somehow works out. And yeah, then I just started building a video game, and just closing the loop on how I got into open source. I really care about open source, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you about it. And I owe most of my career to it. I feel really lucky that I got to work on open source even at Facebook. I didn't go there with the expectation that I would. And so I want Nakazawa Tech, my company, to also be an open source company. And so I'm working on a video game right now. You can check it out. It's called Athena Crisis. I also have stickers. The stickers are really cool. I can give you some later. And I want that entire game to be open source as well. And so it's currently on Steam Early Access. The full launch is in May. But right around that time, when it launches in May, I want to open source the whole thing as well.
Nice. I was again expecting a little bit more romantic reason to start the company than just to have your pension savings payments covered. But I take it.
No, it's not just that. It's more it's. I'm not dreaming of building a large company. I just want to do certain things, and like that just seems like, you know, the only way that, you know, it's like the vehicle that you need to, or the entity that you need to be able to do those things.
Yeah, I get it. Like it takes step-by-step approach to get anywhere, right? So you have to start from starting the company.
Exactly.
Very nice. And there is something really interesting about your game, which is the technology set that you choose. If I remember correctly, you are just using HTML, CSS animations, and JavaScript. No WebGL, still no WebGL.
No WebGL. React, Relay, GraphQL, Socket.io, Emotion, Postgres, Prisma, WebSockets, Redis. Bunch of fun technologies. We should put up the trailer. It's pretty fun.
We can maybe do it at the end. How does it perform? To do
60 frames per second at all times.
Nice.
It might be 120. I don't have like a M3 Mac Pro to test it, but on the M2 Air, it's always at 60 frames per second. And I've gone through a lot of pain to get to that point.
Yes.
It's all just diffs.
It's the pain I'm interested in. I'm sure people as well. Like how far can JavaScript and the CSS get you? And what do you have to do?
So the thing, this is like the silly thing. So I started this, as I said, in paternity leave. And so I put this stupid constraint on myself. I was like, I'm going to figure out the gaming industry. And so I'm going to have to figure out how to do all these things, and like how to build like gamepad support, how to build a game engine, you know? And so I put this constraint on myself. It was just this like, I'm going to do this for fun. I wasn't planning on like shipping it, or not like I'm shipping it now. I have a publisher, for example. And so my constraint was I'm only allowed to use technologies that I've either worked on myself or that I understand enough to be able to write a similar version of it. So it's like, okay, I'm okay with React, Relay, GraphQL, worked on all those, you know. There's a bunch of others, you know, that I understand enough that I could rebuild it. And my thinking was that those are technologies that I understand deeply, but I don't understand game engines. And I don't want to just use a game engine and not understand what's on the stack below me. So if I'm going to build a video game, I'm going to have to build the game engine for it as well. And it's not a very good game engine, but like I built a game, you know, like the problem, like if anybody of you are into games or game development, quite often what happens for people in that situation like me, they end up building a game engine, not a video game. So I built a shitty game engine about a reasonably good video game, not the other way around. And so that was my constraint, which, you know, once then you start founding a company and you're like, okay, you have a company and you need to fill it with meaning, but you also have to become a lot more pragmatic about how you're developing things. And I tried to not violate that constraint. And that's just really totally stupid for, you know, from a business perspective, but that's just what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. And how did you figure out the story or kind of just the mechanics of the game to make it entertaining?
That part is really fun. The crazy thing is, like, this is the weird thing. Like, you know, I think, I don't know, how many of you are like product developers, like working on a product rather than like infrastructure? It's quite a lot, right? And like, how many of you, I don't know, like this is being recorded, so I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but how many of you really care about that product that you're working on? It's still like, yeah, that's good. You know, that's great, but it's not everyone, right? And it's really good. Like, I'm really happy for you folks, but like half of you didn't raise your hands. And so you often end up in this spot where you're like, you know, I love this company. This product is okay. You know, I mean, I worked on Facebook.com, you know, it's like some parts are good, some parts are like, I really don't care, right? And then when your mom adds you as a friend, you're like, I'm not sure if I like working on this thing anymore, right? So anyway, like the thing is that quite often when you work on a product, as an engineer, you don't really have any control of the product. You have a PM that tells you what to do, and you have like a TPM that, you know, manages the progress, or you have an engineering manager or a CEO or a CTO or somebody that tells you this is what the product has got to be, right? And it seems like some of you are in a spot where it's like you can decide this is the product. I love working on it, and like I can like make it better. And so working in like infrastructure, like all you do is like write code, right? And like you build a product, but like the most in terms of art you do is like a logo for the project. And so working on a video game, the cool thing is I'm writing all of the code, but I'm also working as the art director. I hired a bunch of artists. I'm working as the music director. I cannot make music, but there's like an amazing musician that I worked with. If you go to like Spotify or Apple Music, you can type in Athena Crisis. as like a 1-hour soundtrack you can listen to. And it's like modern retro, and it's really good focus music for coding because I have to listen to it all the time. So I want it to be good for coding because otherwise I couldn't work.
That's a good marketing channel.
Yeah, the music is really good. I like it a lot. It's really catchy too and not repetitive. And so I really just like the idea of, hey, I want to make something, like I want to create characters, I want to create like art, I want to create a game world, I want to create the music and like put that all together with the code into a cohesive product, because that's something I hadn't done that much, and like just trying to build an experience. And the game is was being exhibited the last few days in the US in Boston at a big game show. I wasn't there because I'm here. And
thank you.
Apparently a lot of folks between 8 and 13, like a lot of young kids, really loved it. So that's something that makes me super happy.
Yeah, that's nice. Well, seeing how Minecraft is super popular with very limited graphics, I bet that the young people would like retro graphics. You mentioned, or let me introduce this thought first. How do you build kind of the logic of the game in this world? Do you leverage AI at all, or is it kind of hard coded? Does it learn? How did you approach kind of building the game logic?
Yeah, I feel like we have to maybe back up a little bit. It's so if you haven't seen it, it would be cool if we could see it so people have like somewhat of an idea of what it is like. Obviously, in terms of graphics, it's not like the most modern, like, Call of Duty or something. At the same time, web games could technically have like PlayStation 3 to PlayStation 4 graphics at this point in time. The problem is when you're a single developer going for 3D, like building a 3D game engine is incredibly hard. It would probably take me 5 to 10 years instead of 2, or like a year and a half. And the 3D assets, if you don't want to use something off the shelf that makes it look like everyone else's game, the costs are insane as well, right? So Athena Crisis is like actually kind of a social network with a game inside, or like a game with a social network inside, because you can watch other people, like you can go into the game and watch anyone else play as well, because it's just a website basically. But the graphics is like 2D pixel art, like kind of retro, but like in a modern style, very colorful. And it's turn-based. So, it's kind of like chess, except you have more colors, you have different maps kind of instead of the fixed chessboard, and you have different types of units that can do different things. And so all of that is running through immutable data structures. And the cool thing is that the game runs on a client and on the server at the same time. So all of the user interface is optimistic. So you take an action, it runs on a client, and the server just verifies it basically. And the thing that I felt really proud of is, so I really don't like app stores, but I had to submit it to Steam. Steam is like the big app store for games. And they came back and rejected the game, and they said, hey, the store page says that this game is like online, but we couldn't find any online functionality in your game. But at the same time, when you open the Electron app that I submitted to them, all it does is load a URL to like an online game, and it like logged them in automatically. They didn't even notice. And they even played a game against another human. And they're like, this doesn't have any online functionality. So I felt really proud because it meant that the UI feels like it's all local, but they were playing a game on a server.
Thank you for that intro. Back to the AI elements.
Right.
Is it easier these days when you're kind of building the AI functionality to build it using the new developments with LLMs?
Yeah, so I haven't seen an LLM that can play chess, right? There's very specialized AIs that can play chess really well, better than humans, but LLMs are extremely bad at following these sort of rules. And Athena Crisis is way more complex in terms of the map setup, in terms of the units, in terms of what you can do with them. So they are really far off from like being able to play a game like that. At the same time, I've used ChatGPT a lot as like a maybe junior developer on the game to help out, like build some things. The AI for Athena Crisis is also one of those things that I have never built an AI before. And I don't know if the AI I built is good, because I also just decided that I don't understand. Well, I realized I don't understand what people write about building video game AIs. So I just thought I'm just going to go figure out how to write one. And I don't know, like it might be like a really bad one. It works reasonably well. It's better players are saying it's better than in comparable games, but I still feel like it's still pretty weak in some points. But yeah, I don't know. Like there's all these people that come to me and they're like, hey, I want to learn to code. I don't know how to, like, shall I like learn this or learn that? And I'm always like, just go and build something. And that's just the only way that works for me as well. Like I can read other people's experience about like, hey, this is what I did or whatever. And I'm like, I don't know how to build an AI. So I just sit down. I'm like, okay, how can I take how I played this game and turn it into a computer that plays the game in the same way, basically? Maybe a bit dumber because I cannot figure out how to make it better.